Welcome to Through the Bible with Pastor Michael, a podcast from First Baptist Church in Mustang, Oklahoma. Here's Pastor Michael.
Today in 1 Samuel, this is May, day 17, and we are in chapters 13, 14, and 15. A little bit longer reading today. That middle chapter, verse 14, is pretty lengthy. But as I feel like I keep saying, that these are important chapters because we're just learning more of the flow of the Old Testament. So again, particularly for those who this may be your first time to read through the Bible, or maybe the Old Testament's just very fuzzy and difficult, pay careful attention as you're reading here, because so much of the narrative of the Old Testament is unfolding right in front of us in these chapters. As we talked about yesterday, the people desired a king, and that was because they want to be like the other nations. They go from a theocracy where God reigns over them as their king. He had to give them judges to lead them. But the people wanted the king, and so that changes things. The kingdom of Israel, the kingship, is going to be known in these three men, Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. And then that kingdom is going to split, as we talked about yesterday in 931, and we're going to get two kingdoms. The kingdom of the north is Israel, the kingdom of the south is Judah. But the question is, Saul has been made king. Why does eventually, not yet, but why does eventually the kingship go from Saul to somebody else? Well, we know it goes from Saul to David. Why is that? We find out in our reading today. And so read carefully, because the Old Testament should be coming together a bit for you and crystallizing in some of the details. So let's get to 5 observations from our reading today. Number 1, Saul offers a sacrifice himself, but was not authorized to, as he was the king, but not the priest. And so he is to be waiting on Samuel. Samuel doesn't come within those 7 days. And so Saul takes matters into his own hands, offers a sacrifice right as Samuel is walking up. But because Saul was the king, he had certain things he was to do, but he also had certain things he was not to do. He was a king, not a priest, and so he could lead the people, but he was not the one to offer sacrifices. So that's a pretty significant development as the Old Testament narrative unfolds. Second, Saul is told his throne would be taken from him and given to another family. That was because of his disobedience. Third, Saul's reign was marked by hard fighting with the Philistines. We see this at the end of chapter 14, verse 52. There was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. And so that's what his years of his being the king is marked by, hard fighting. We see, fourthly, Saul is told God is more delighted in obedience than with sacrifice. So Saul has offered a sacrifice which he was not authorized to do, and he is then confronted by Samuel, and Samuel speaks to Saul, chapter 15, in verse 22, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice." And so this becomes a very important statement. Not only is it important in the context of the story of King Saul, it's a very important thing for us to understand in our life today, that the Lord wants us to obey his word. And disobeying his word, even under the cloak of religious ceremony, is not pleasing to the Lord. And then we see, fifthly, Saul did not do all God told him to do, so Samuel has to kill Agag, the king of the Amalekites. Pretty graphic display here at the end of the chapter, because Saul did not obey the fullness of what he was told to do. And so Samuel does that. That's chapter 15, verse 33. Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. What does this mean for us? Number one, everyone must be submissive to God's commands. Everybody is submissive to God's commands. It doesn't matter if you are the king, doesn't matter if you are a prophet, doesn't matter today if you are a missionary or if you are a pastor or if you are a leader in a church, if you are a deacon, if you are an elder in the church. Doesn't matter what your title is, doesn't matter what your position is. Everyone must be submissive to God's commands. A second application, we should never make excuses for our disobedience. This is something that is so easy for us to fall into. We disobey and we want to blame somebody else. We get caught speeding, and rather than admitting fault, we're upset because the speed limit was too low. It shouldn't be that low anyway. Or we disrespect our spouse and we make an excuse for it. We are unkind to our children and we make an excuse for it. Well, I just had a very busy day at work, whatever it may be. But the lesson to learn here is that we never want to make excuses for our disobedience. We want to obey God's commands no matter who we are. And if we fail, when we sin, we want to confess our sin, not hide it, not lie about it, not try to cover it, not try to justify it, not try to excuse it away. If we're wrong, let's confess that sin. Number three, no matter our position, our only hope is in the Lord. We never get to a place or a status where we can rely on ourselves. Our only hope is in the Lord. Saul has been anointed king, but his only hope is in the Lord. If he fails to obey the Lord, if not for the Lord's kindness and strength at work in his life, then Saul will not be able to be successful. We never reach a place in our life where we can rely on ourselves. We don't rely on our gifting. We don't rely on our education. We don't rely on our experience. Our hope is in the Lord, and no matter our position in life, that's always true. A fourth application, all sin has a consequence. Now, the consequence may not be as significant in an earthly sense as what Saul did. Saul's disobedience, and so the kingdom's going to be taken from him. That's about as severe as you can get in an earthly sense. But all sin has a consequence. All sin is hurting us and influencing and impacting those around us. And so we want to take all of life seriously, all of God's commands seriously. Every day we live, we are either obeying the Lord closer and closer, more and more, or we're becoming comfortable with sin. And this is the big danger with sin. It doesn't take long before sin becomes comfortable for us. You lie one time and you feel terrible, and your stomach hurts, and you're just all upset about it. You lie a second time, you still feel bad about it, not quite as bad as the first time. You lie a third or fourth time, and you start to get used to that feeling, and then pretty soon, lying just becomes a habit. It just becomes a way of life, and you no longer feel that conviction. That's a dangerous, dangerous place to be. Sin has a consequence, and that consequence is either going to lead you to repentance or it's going to lead you to be numb to its effects. And that's always a dangerous place to live. And then a fifth application, that we are to confess any area of disobedience in our life. Any area. We tend to think in terms of big sin and small sin. But the truth is, any area of our life where we are tolerating disobedience, tolerating sin, we need to confess that to the Lord and deal with that and seek the Lord's grace and forgiveness, and then change and stop living in that sin. One of the challenges of what we're doing this year is trying to hit these main highlights, and I'm trying to lead you through the story of these chapters and hopefully lead you in some helpful personal application from each chapter without getting bogged down in just preaching, because we're reading usually 3 chapters a day, and I can't do that. But I do want to share one very, very brief word. I'm not going to take the time, just for the sake of what we're doing in these daily videos, to treat this as full as I would like to. I just want to say a brief word, because in chapter 15, This is one of the places that can be very difficult to understand as you're reading this. So I just want to not ignore it and touch on it very briefly. Chapter 15, verse 11 or verse 10, the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. But then in verse 29 it says, also the glory of Israel will not lie or have regret, for he is not a man that he should have regret. And then the end of verse 35, Samuel did not see Saul again till the day of his death, but Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. So in one sense, we see in verse 11, the Lord regrets making him king. We see in verse 35, the Lord regrets making him king. But in another sense, in verse 29, he does not have regret, because he's not a man that he should have regret. And just a quick word of how to understand that, because I know this can be a pretty difficult thing to read here to try to figure out in chapter 15. I think what we see here is that the Lord has said he's taking the kingship away from Saul. Now, it's not going to happen immediately, but it's going to happen. It's definite. And the idea here is that God is not a man that he can be overpowered in his decree. If the Lord has said, this is what I'm doing, there is no one strong enough to make him fail to do that. And so the text is saying the Lord is not a man in that he can be overpowered, where somebody can, against his will, talk him out of it, where somebody can, against God's will, change his mind, where somebody can be so convincing that God is backed into a corner. And so in that sense, the Lord is not a man or have the regret of a man where he can be, where his decree can stop or cease to come to pass. In another sense, though, sin does grieve the heart of God. And so one of my favorite Old Testament commentators, Dale Ralph Davis, speaking about this, I just want to read briefly what he says about this. Verse 11 does not intend to suggest Yahweh's fickleness of purpose, but his sorrow over sin. It does not depict Yahweh flustered over lack of foresight, but Yahweh grieved over lack of obedience. He writes later, Yahweh has torn the kingdom from Saul, and that is definite. It is not unrepentable. And then he says, only in the consistent God of verse 29 and in the sorrowful God of verse 35 do we find the God worthy of praise. Here is a God who is neither fickle in his ways nor indifferent in his responses. Here is a God who has both firmness and feeling. And then just a quick summary from Proverbs 26, 17 to 28. Do not lie and mislead and then try to cover it by saying you were only joking. This is a proverb that's really good to teach your children. And for that matter, it's a proverb good for us as adults to memorize and to consider too. It says in verse 18 of Proverbs 26, like a madman who throws firebrands, arrows, and death is the man who deceives his neighbor and says, I am only joking. He deceives his neighbor, he gets caught, and his defense is, oh, I was just kidding. He says that's like a madman throwing arrows around. So we don't want to go through life misleading people and then to try to cover it, just say, I was only kidding. It's actually a great lesson in life for us to remember. All right, enjoy the reading today. Be blessed as you study.